I would now like to welcome Professor Jeffrey Sachs as our first speaker, who is joining us online. He is a professor at Columbia University and director of the university's Center for Sustainable Development. He spent over 20 years as a professor at Harvard University, where he received his BA, MA, and PhD. He is also a best-selling author. Well known for his bold and effective strategies to address complex global challenges, Professor Sachs served with a range of organizations. He has held the position of Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General for 3 terms. Presently, he is an SDG advocate under the UN Secretary General, President of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, co-chair of the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, and Commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development. Professor Sachs, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everybody, and thank you for including me in this session. I am not an expert in multilingual education. I am your student in this regard, and I'm very eager to learn from you. But in my neck of the woods at the United Nations, my responsibility for the UN is to help raise funding for the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's why I was very keen to spend a few minutes with you today. Because I want to encourage you, the leaders of mother tongue-based multilingual education, to give us some guidance in the finance side of things, of what is needed to achieve your policy objectives. I'm fully convinced that you are making an absolutely crucial contribution to what is in effect an education crisis, since we see in places where a mother tongue primary schooling is not available, huge deficits in educational attainment and huge lost opportunities for children, which often remain for a lifetime. So I'm convinced by you that we need to ensure multilingual education, mother tongue-based education, and I operate in an overall context of a massive budget crisis and massive financing shortfall for SDG 4. So my starting point is that there are hundreds of millions of kids that are not in school, even in school, much less receiving mother tongue-based education. They're not even in school. And the overwhelming reason for this is not lack of care of governments or lack of care of parents or concern of communities, poverty. Because most low-income countries, simply put, cannot afford SDG 4. SDG 4 calls for quality education that would include multilingual education. Quality education for all learners from pre-K through at least upper secondary completion. I'm an economist, so I look at the dollars and cents or the baht or the euro implications of that commitment. And it is easy to demonstrate the tragic reality of poverty that a low-income country, no matter how well-intentioned, simply cannot finance SDG 4. And this is due to 3 considerations that I want to bring to your clear attention. One is that in most low-income countries, the populations are young, and that means that the proportion of the population that is at school age is unusually high. And this is especially true in sub-Saharan Africa, less true in Asia, but especially true in sub-Saharan Africa, where often 35% of the population is in school age. So a tremendously large cohort that reflects the high fertility rates and therefore the very young population age structure. The second is that the cost of education measured in units of GDP per capita. In other words, how many units of GDP per capita does it cost to educate a child is unusually high in a low-income setting. The reason is that the proportion of the workforce that is at a skill level and education level needed for teaching is low. This is almost by definition in a low-income country. So teachers need to make much higher salaries than workers that have not gone through the higher education. Their salaries are higher, or else they won't show up in the education system, or they'll be a part of brain drain. And so in order to finance quality education, a low-income country might have to spend maybe 50% of GDP per capita per student, or even higher, whereas a high-income country, say in the United States, where the average income is $65,000, the cost of educating a child might be $13,000 to $15,000 per year. It might be 20% of the per capita GDP, whereas in a low-income country, 50% of the per capita GDP. Well, you combine those two facts that there are lots of kids per capita, and there is a high cost per student measured in GDP per capita. We're talking about the need to spend 10 to 20% of GDP, 10 to 20% of GDP on education in a low-income setting. The third fact is that low-income countries collect relatively low revenues as a share of GDP. In other words, the total budget revenue collection might be 15% of GDP or 20% of GDP, because much of the population is in rural communities, often subsistence agriculture. The tax collections from that are very modest or non-existent. And so the revenue base of governments is low necessarily because we're talking about poor countries, but even as a share of that low income, relatively low. So as an economist looking at budgeting for education, there is an incredible crisis. And the crisis is that for every country I know in sub-Saharan Africa, these governments can't afford to keep the kids in school, much less give them a more complex environment of multilingual education, perhaps requiring specially trained teachers or more teachers per student population, and so on. Now, this leads to a financing gap that could be as large as 10% of GDP or even 15% of GDP in low-income countries just for the education sector alone. The result of that is that education is not provided. That the school system says, look, we can give you free education up through 6th grade or up through 8th grade, but upper secondary, you have to pay school fees, school tuition, boarding school, and so on. This is pervasive in Africa, and it's not unusual in low-income parts of Asia, Central America, and South America. So my point is very basic, which is we need a lot more money in primary education. I've been, as a kind introduction noted, special advisor to the Secretary General for 3 Secretaries General, and I've been making this point repeatedly in the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. It's been my shocking experience that education attracts very little financing. The levels of development assistance for education are minuscule, even compared to health, which does not command vast resources, but is much better supported in development assistance than is education. And strangely, nobody really takes notice of this. The poor countries don't educate the kids. They get blamed for it. Well, corruption, governments don't care, and so forth. No one really looks at the budget. I understand on the panel will be an esteemed colleague from the World Bank. Let me just say to the World Bank, it is the World Bank's responsibility, I would say, to ensure that there is financing for every child everywhere in the world. And if the World Bank can't do it in its own portfolio, it needs to work with the partner institutions in the regional development banks to do. And it needs to say to the IMF, you can't approve a program where half the kids are not finishing upper secondary school and tell them, well, we applaud the authorities for their macroeconomic stability. That's completely unacceptable. If we don't fund education, we don't fund development. It's as simple as that. There is no goal among the 17 SDGs more important for success than SDG 4, which is funding education for every child. So what I really want to ask from you, the community of experts, multilingual education, is how it should be done. Very practically. And asking about whether it's different kinds of teacher training, using online modules in addition, in which case children need support with also devices or data, more teachers, scaling up of the education workforce, community education workers. I'd like to understand, first, the mechanics. What should be done? And of course, I understand this will differ in different contexts, but I would like you to give us and me the guidance, what should be done, especially in a very low resource setting, because I've faced this problem in Africa for 20 years. I don't know what to do about it, but I have seen this problem on the ground about the education, about mother tongue versus national language. But it's so under-addressed and under-resourced. So I'd like to understand two basic points from this community. One is, what is the process that you recommend for addressing this issue in terms of education workforce, in terms of curriculum design, in terms of use of ancillary infrastructure, line I'm curious about, though maybe for young children that doesn't help so much, but I'd like to understand in terms of teacher training, teacher recruitment, a specialized curriculum preparation, and so forth. And second, what does it cost? And that's hard. Costing is not an easy exercise, and of course it depends local context very much. But I would be most grateful to learn from you in this short period of time how to incorporate this concern into my advocacy on SDG 4 finance. In the coming months, I'm going to have particular responsibilities, SDG financing in the G20 context, in the IMF World Bank context, and in some other venues. And I want to make SDG 4 financing a central feature of that. I really want to work closely with the World Bank on this because I don't want to go another year where we are accepting the fact that hundreds of millions of kids are out of school. I find this the most unbelievable tragedy and stupidity of our international order right now. But I really want to incorporate your program design features and the budgeting needed for it. So let me stop there. I hope I made clear why I'm so honored to be with you. I can promise you there are going to be some very important discussions in the next few months on SDG financing that are going to make a difference. And I would like to help you in your mission, but I need, since I'm a lowly economist, I would like to know the dollars and cents of what you have in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. Actually, this is quite interesting because we were hoping to ask questions to you about how to solve the problem. Now you've asked the problem to us to help you get a good understanding of what kind of messages you could give at the G20, for example, to advocate in a much stronger way on how we could actually achieve increasing financing for education, which has been actually on our agendas for many years, and we know this continues to be one of the main barriers to actually getting to what we committed to in 2015, and even before that in 2000 and when EFA was actually created. So it continues to be on all of our agendas. Now, can I ask you, can you stay with us a little bit? Because actually after this presentation, we'll have two eminent speakers, as I mentioned in the beginning. We'll have Professor Dina Ocampo, who will actually provide you and provide all of us with reflections on policy formulations and implementation of reform, meaning really looking at the experience she made based on her research from across the region and the Philippines, and really good lessons and successes and how this could be done. And by the same token, we then have Dr. Christian Aero, who will also speak about effective language instruction policy to foundational learning, but also MLE. So I think that will provide you some of the answers. So if you stay with us, I mean, actually what we had planned, because we didn't know how long we had time, to ask you one follow-up question now, which we can do. But also what we usually do, we have all the presenters speak and then open for question and answers so that then the audience can ask questions to the different presenters. So if you could just quickly let us know, stay for the entire session, and we just wait and then ask questions afterwards.
Yeah, maybe I could take one question now, and I will stay as long as I can. I may get beeped off, but I'm going to stay on for as long as I can.
Right. So actually, the follow-up question that we prepared is it's also based on, again, your very steering speech that you gave at TESS, which is a little bit in the same line as you just mentioned now, meaning really the definitely strong need for increasing funding for education, and also thinking about targeted funding mechanisms, because funding as such for SDG4 is one, but how do we look at the more specific needs? In this case today, we're talking about MLE as sort of really a key enabler of foundational learning, which of course is something that we all agree to is something we have to start with if we want to achieve education for all and learning for all, and also looking at equity. Just, I mean, from your long experience and having spoken to governments, to donors, what is that we can say to them to advocate for stronger MLE, and to convince them actually that MLE is a good investment? And then, well, basically what you can say to the people in the room, we have many policymakers in the room here too, that would like to know how this can be done. If you have just a couple of quick ideas on that, that would be brilliant. So thank you, Professor.
Great, thank you very much. Education financing in general. The returns to educating a child are very high, but they take 30 years to realize those returns. So if we think about a young child today, went through upper secondary and some kind of skills or tertiary education, and then entering the labor market and having higher skills that generate higher incomes, and by the way, higher tax revenues 25 years from now, we're talking about a long-term investment with very high returns. The first point is, in order to finance that, requires either grants or long-term, low-interest financing. Either can do. Loans or grants can both work to finance education. I have no problem with even a low-income country taking on loans to finance the education sector, as long as the loan is a 40-year loan, so that there's plenty of time for the economy to grow and to repay the loan. The level of actual official financing available is tiny. This is the tragedy. We have a check-the-box approach, meaning, oh, we've done that. An example of that is the Global Partnership for Education. Very wonderful concept, very nice organization, underfunded at least by one order of magnitude. The GPE disperses maybe $700 or $800 million a year. Are you kidding? It should be a $10 billion a year operation minimum. But GP is very polite to its donors. The donors are cheapskates. And so we get big celebrations of replenishment rounds for what is 1/10 of what's actually needed. And it's worse than that, because then the donors say, oh, we contribute to GP. We're good, loyal supporters of GP. And so we have a broken system that fakes it. And we need to stop faking it. We need the real numbers. So I'd like to see GPE at least, we need GPE at least $10 billion a year. That's something real, by the way, easily affordable by the rich countries and the upper middle incomes. And then we need massive scale up, long-term financing from the World Bank, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, and so forth. Those are loans, long-term, 30 to 40-year loans, preferably 40-year loans. Massive scale. There's even an idea now, oh, don't borrow for education. But then you leave the kids without any education at all. When it comes to MLE, my proposal would be that national governments take the lead in formulating their education framework that they then take for funding support from the international system, an expanded GPE and an expanded multilateral development banking system. And that, as in the case of something that I helped to originate, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, there would be guidelines to national governments that MLE can and should be part of your submission of your national strategy, and it will be funded. So don't leave it out. And that becomes a guideline for technical review of national programs that are being submitted for international financing. And so we build MLE into the core of the financing arrangements, but we don't make a separate MLE track separate from a national education strategy. We say that MLE should be fully incorporated into a national strategy. We don't have the donors dictate the national strategy. We don't have it as some kind of special World Bank loan. We have a national education strategy in each country that aims to achieve SDG 4 and that is properly resourced through domestic resources and international resources. And international resources would be at least 3 sources: an expanded grant mechanism from GPE, an expanded loan mechanism from the World Bank, and an expanded loan mechanism from the regional development bank. That would be good. A lot of professional eyes would be on this process. MLE would be built right into the core of it. There would be extra budget lines, and that's one of the things I'd like to understand. I'm sure that the returns would be extremely high, and it could be demonstrated because I've read your research, and it's very credible. But it should be built into an environment in which national governments are told, look, you should do this for your children and for their learning. And there will be financial support, so you don't have to roll your eyes being told to do something you can't afford. Rather, we understand that this is part of a global system for proper education finance.
Thank you very much. You provided us with a lot of, I think, very important elements. I mean, starting with calling upon, the international finance community, starting with the World Bank, who is with us today, and will certainly also provide some answers to calls and new proposals right now. GPE as well, meaning really having to increase the financing package and long-term loans, but at the same time also on governments to really very firmly embed MLE within their national education strategies and their financing strategies. So thank you very much.